I shouldn't have to prove my innocence. Silence, then whispers. People scribbled in notebooks, taking down his every word. But those words weren't just words, they were the truth. Zion wasn't just fighting a false accusation. He was fighting a system built to break people like him. And that system was still there. Lorraine led him through the crowd, but before they reached the car, a voice called out to Zion, "Hey, kid." Zion turned, but he wasn't alone this time. Mr. Langford, the school librarian, stood beside him, not alone. Several of Zion's classmates were there too, standing firm by his side during these difficult times. Even the kids Zion had protected didn't say much, the silence between them a testament to what had happened. "You did it," Langford said, looking at Zion. "You made them listen." Zion swallowed, his eyes thoughtful. "Yes, but what about the kids who don't get a chance?" Langford didn't rush to answer. He looked at Zion seriously, then smiled softly. "Maybe it's your job to make sure they get a chance." Langford's words were a challenge, and they haunted Zion. Because this story wasn't just about him, it was about all the kids left behind. In the days that followed, the internal investigation headed by Sergeant Kincaid took center stage. More stories came out, more names came out. Other kids, other cases, other traumas. Some had pleaded guilty just to get it over with. But there were people who had lost years of their lives, because of an unfair system. Zion had won the case, but the fight wasn't over. He hadn't done his job. A week later, Zion returned to the school library. He held a notebook and walked over to Langford's desk. Langford looked up, eyes filled with curiosity. "What do you have?" Langford asked. Zion put the notebook down on the desk and opened it. "A list," he replied. Langford raised an eyebrow, glancing at the notebook. "What?" "Everything I've read. Every law, every rule," Zion breathed. "Every trick they use to keep people quiet." He pushed the notebook toward Langford. "I want to help kids like me. So they don't have to go through what I went through. And so this never happens again." Langford smiled, nodding slightly. "Then you should get to work." Zion nodded. He understood. Justice never comes easy, but when you fight for it, you make it harder to ignore. And this fight, it's just beginning. Zion could feel the small changes in his body. The tight grip on his wrist, the way he avoided the eyes of those around him, all of it seemed to pile up. Then the judge said, "We're going to take a short break before the jury deliberates." Zion glanced quickly at Kincaid, something in his heart that couldn't be put down. "I want to talk to the prosecutor in my office," the judge continued, and that was not a good sign. Zion sat down, breathing lightly, as if to find some space for himself. His mother reached out from the back row, gently squeezing his shoulder. "You're amazing," she whispered, but Zion couldn't celebrate, couldn't feel happy yet. 20 minutes passed, and everyone was back in their seats. The jury had reached a decision. The executioner called the court for orders. The foreman stood up. "This is it," he said. The judge nodded as the jury returned its verdict. The foreman cleared his throat, looking straight at Zion. "On the charge of burglary, we find the defendant Zion Whitaker not guilty." A wave of relief swept through Zion's chest. Lorraine sighed behind him, her hands clasped in silent prayer. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned to the prosecutor. "After reviewing the evidence and new information, I am ordering the district attorney's office to open an internal investigation into Sergeant Kincaid's conduct." A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Kincaid's face turned red. "Your Honor, this is nonsense." The judge interrupted, his voice firm. "I will be very careful what you say next, officer. This court has seen enough today." Everyone fell silent. Zion watched Kincaid sit there, a man trapped by his own words. Just as Zion had been just days ago. But now Zion was no longer the one in handcuffs. The judge cleared his throat. This case is adjourned. The gavel rang, and the trial was over. Zion turned, and before he could react, Lorraine pulled him into a hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. But even as relief washed over him, Zion knew that this wasn't just about him. Because if Kincaid had done this to him, how many others had been silenced? Zion hadn't stopped fighting. He hadn't left the courthouse, and the sky outside felt bigger, lighter. Zion had entered as a defendant, but now he was walking out free. But freedom wasn't the same anymore, it was worth more when you fought for it. A crowd of reporters gathered near the steps. Cameras flashed, microphones pushed toward Zion. "How does it feel to prove your innocence?" Someone called out to him to stop. His mother's hand was on his shoulder, steadying him. He could have said he felt relieved, or he could have said he felt angry, tired. But he chose to say nothing. Instead, Zion looked straight into the camera lens. Zion stared silently ahead, his eyes unwavering. He turned back to the jury, his voice even and calm. "As I said, the store's security system isn't as reliable as we think. The cameras at the entrance aren't always accurate in terms of height." He continued, his voice soft but firm. "The important thing is that the photos you're seeing don't conclusively link me to the crime." Kincaid couldn't hide his nervousness, his body shifting slightly in his chair. He knew Zion's question wouldn't be easy to answer. "So, Mr. Kincaid, did you search me when you arrested me?" Zion asked, his voice unwavering. Kincaid's fingers began tapping the armrest, showing his nervousness. "Of course I did." Zion looked straight at Kincaid and continued. "So are the shoes I'm wearing the same as the suspects?" Kincaid hesitated, then bowed his head, but only for a moment, long enough for everyone in the room to notice. The prosecutor hurriedly spoke up, "We don't have to prove every detail." Zion interrupted, "But, prosecutor, every detail is important. And when a detail is omitted, the truth is obscured." The judge's sharp gaze shifted to the prosecutor. "What direct evidence can link the defendant to this case?" he asked. The prosecutor was speechless, but Zion seized the opportunity. "So there is no clear evidence. Everything is conjecture, and conjecture cannot replace the truth." Zion said, his eyes fixed on Kincaid, as if challenging him. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Zion suddenly stepped forward, not in a hurry, but spoke softly, "Your Honor, may I present a few points of clarification?" The judge nodded. Zion didn't hesitate to pull a piece of paper from his pocket. "Here's Sergeant Kincaid's disciplinary report," Zion said, looking at the prosecutor. All eyes were on Kincaid. The judge asked, "Are you aware of any complaints that have been filed against you?" Kincaid's eyes were tense, his fists clenched. "This has nothing to do with the case," he said, his voice hoarse. Zion didn't budge, turning back to the jury. "I think it matters. If a police officer has been sued for misconduct, wouldn't his credibility in this case be in question?" The prosecutor quickly objected, but the judge raised his hand to stop him. Zion sensed the change in the atmosphere, and the doubt that had begun to creep into the courtroom. He knew he had the jury's attention, and they were no longer looking at him as a suspect. Zion sensed his confidence, his certainty, not someone who expected to lose. The judge entered, an older man with silver hair and deep lines on his face. The trial began, and Zion felt the weight of everything that awaited him. The prosecutor stood up, a woman in a navy suit, her voice razor sharp. "The evidence is clear, the defendant was seen near the scene of the crime. Sergeant Kincaid, a veteran of more than 20 years on the force, was brought to testify at the trial. He had been arrested on probable cause, and the prosecutor argued that the case was clear. It all speaks for itself," she stated, terse but decisive. Zion couldn't help but grit his teeth. The words, probable cause, had stolen so many days from him. The prosecutor turned and continued walking toward the jury. "This case is not complicated," she said, continuing to explain. "The store had been broken into, merchandise had been stolen, and a person had been seen near the scene, wearing a hoodie and sneakers. It all makes sense," she concluded, making it all seem clean and irrefutable. Zion felt his fingers clench, anger rising. But he kept his composure as his lawyer stood. He didn't know what he was going to say next, but he hoped that his lawyer wouldn't ruin his only chance. The lawyer began, in a soft voice, "My client maintains his innocence. We will prove that the evidence is not compelling enough to convict him." It was all he could do. Zion closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain his frustration. He had prepared himself for this. He didn't want to be brought down, thrown under the wheels of justice. The judge turned to Zion, his tone stern. "Mr. Whitaker, I understand you want to defend yourself." Zion took a deep breath, feeling the tension in the air, his mother sitting behind him, holding her breath. He stood up, the whole courtroom was silent. Zion glanced at the jury, then he stepped forward, speaking in a steady voice, "Let's talk about the evidence." He took a deep breath, then pointed to the prosecutor's table, "Where's the security footage?" The prosecutor turned, responding with a nod, "We'll show it now." A blurry video was played, showing a person wearing a hoodie and sneakers, but the face was completely obscured. Zion folded his arms, his demeanor firm, "That's definitely not me." The prosecutor frowned, looking at him, "That's you." Zion shook his head, "No." He turned to the judge, "Your Honor, may I ask a question?" The judge nodded, and Zion asked, "Officer Kincaid, how tall am I?" The question surprised Kincaid, I don't know, about 5 feet 4 inches. Zion pointed to the screen, then explained to me why, according to the security camera log, the suspect in the video is about 5 feet 9 inches. I'm only 5 feet 4 inches. There was a long pause in the courtroom, as all eyes turned to Kincaid. Everyone noticed the obvious difference. The judge leaned toward the prosecutor, "Do you have any explanation for this difference?" Zion couldn't let them decide his future. He barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment in the police station. The handcuffs, Kincaid's smiling eyes, the negotiations that felt like he was selling a child's life. Zion knew something was wrong. By morning, his decision was clear. If no one else would fight for him, he would fight for himself. He skipped lunch and headed straight to the library, where there were old books and scant reference materials. Nothing modern or comprehensive, but it was all he could get his hands on. He picked up a thick book called Criminal Procedure and flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning for any information that might help him understand his situation. He started with the basics of the burden of proof, that the prosecution had to prove his guilt, not the other way around. He read about the chain of evidence and how if the police didn't handle it right, evidence could be thrown out. While police testimony carried weight, inconsistencies could undermine its credibility. As he continued reading, the truth began to become clearer: they had nothing to charge him with. No fingerprints, no physical evidence, just a blurry video of a person in a hoodie. And then, a thought flashed through his mind. How tall was the suspect? Zion wasn't tall compared to his friends, he was only about 5 feet 4 inches, what if the person in the video was taller? Could he prove it wasn't him? He picked up another book called Cross-Interrogation Techniques. Just then, the librarian, Mr. Langford, a gray-haired man with thick glasses, walked by and looked at him. "What's this?" he asked, glancing at the stack of books. Langford paused, looked at Zion for a long moment, then said, "You're in trouble." Zion hesitated. He could have lied and said it was just a research project, but the old man's gaze made him sigh. "Yes." Langford pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "You should know what you're doing." For the next hour, Zion went through it all: how he'd been convicted, the plea deal, the lack of evidence. Langford was quiet, nodding occasionally, then leaning back. You have good instincts, but the court doesn't judge by facts, it's how you present them. Zion nodded, taking careful notes as Langford explained courtroom strategy, how to make a jury see the truth, how to sow doubt, how to ask the right questions. By the time he left the library, Zion's notebook was full of ideas. He wasn't just hoping for justice anymore, he was preparing for the real fight. But the biggest test was yet to come. The courtroom wouldn't be as easy as the library. It smelled of old wood and coffee. Zion sat at the defense table, his hands clasped together, his heart beating like a steady drum in his chest. His attorney sat beside him, flipping through his notes, but he seemed to pay no attention to them. Across the room, Sergeant Roy Kincaid sat stoic in his uniform, his arms folded across his chest. The first thing they took was his name. Then his fingerprints, the only traces of his past. Then his shoelaces, small reminders of a normal life. They treated him like a criminal, even though he was just a kid trying to survive. A tired policeman, his eyes almost emotionless, ordered Zion into a hard metal chair, without a trace of sympathy. His mother was on the phone. The man's voice on the phone sounded calm, unhurried. Like this was just a formality, another case being processed. Zion swallowed the lump in his throat, staring up at the ceiling, wishing time would stop so he wouldn't have to face the truth. His mother, Lorraine Whitaker, was a strong woman who had worked 2 jobs to raise Zion. She was the one person Zion didn't want to see worried. The minutes stretched to an hour. Then another. Finally, the door to the interrogation room opened. Lorraine stormed in, her eyes never leaving Zion, as if searching for some sign of danger. But when she looked at the officer, her voice was cold. "Where's his lawyer? What's he facing?" Sergeant Kincaid walked in, his eyes determined, his arms crossed. His police badge glinted in the light. "We have surveillance cameras." He was near the scene of the crime. He continued, his tone professional, as if it were no big deal. "It was a store that was broken into, tools stolen. He fits the description of the suspect." Lorraine's nose flared, the tension in the air palpable. Sneakers, a dark hoodie, that was what the cameras picked up. Zion looked at his mother, his teeth clenched. Lorraine's hands clenched into fists, trying to control the anger that was rising inside her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "My son is on his way to school." Kincaid shrugged. "That's what you said." The rage in Lorraine's eyes could have set the room on fire, but it wasn't what saved Zion from this. A man in a wrinkled suit finally entered, flipping through a file. Although he seemed rushed, he skimmed through Zion's case like it was nothing important. For the first time in the hallway, the public defender barely looked at Zion. They had offered a plea deal. Lorraine's head turned toward the attorney. He sighed, seemingly exhausted. If he pleads guilty, he can avoid a trial, he'll get community probation. Zion felt like a heavy stone was pressing down on his chest. Plead guilty, an option for something he had never done before. Lorraine's voice hardened, "We're not signing anything." The lawyer sighed, his eyes knowing that nothing would change. "I understand, Mrs. Whitaker. But cases like this never end well." For him, it was Zion's word against the police's. A trial would probably make things worse. But Lorraine interrupted, "No, we're not signing anything." Zion could feel the tension in the air. His mother was right. No one could change their minds. But what scared Zion wasn't the system's resistance. It was the way everyone in this room had decided his fate. Zion Whitaker was in no hurry. The drive to school was routine, a 15-minute drive past cracked sidewalks and old storefronts. The world around him seemed to be lost in the quiet of early morning, as the sun just broke through the gray, overcast clouds. His backpack slung over one shoulder felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was because of the upcoming debate tournament, or maybe it was because of the history test he'd stayed up late studying for. Either way, it was just a normal day until it wasn't. A siren blared, pulling Zion from his thoughts. Before him, the red and blue flashing lights of police cars reflected on the sidewalk, and chaos began to unfold. A store window was shattered, yellow tape was drawn up, and a police officer was talking to the store owner. And then, he heard someone call out, "Where are your hands? Can you see them?" Zion didn't have time to process what was happening before a cop lunged at him, hand on his gun. Sergeant Roy Kincaid, a name he knew, not because of his protection, but because of the times he'd bothered Zion before. Zion's heart pounded, his wrists instinctively lifting as the cop grabbed him. A sharp pain shot up his shoulder as his wrists were pulled behind his back, and before he could react, cold handcuffs were locking him in place. "We got him," Kincaid yelled into the radio. Zion couldn't understand, but Kincaid's mocking laughter made him realize that reality was setting in. He hadn't been near the store, and hadn't done anything, but why had this happened? Kincaid sneered, citing the description from the security camera, that Zion was the man they were looking for. A small crowd began to gather, the traffic slowed, but no one moved. People just stood there watching, holding up their phones to record, as if they were witnessing something unbelievable. As the police pushed Zion toward the patrol car, his heart pounded, but all he could do was follow, unable to resist. It couldn't be true, but as the cold door closed behind him, Zion knew his life would never be the same again. But the story had only just begun. The patrol car smelled of sweat and old leather. Zion sat silently, his wrists still cuffed tightly behind his back. Every little movement made the handcuffs cut deeper into his flesh. He wanted to scream, want them to check the cameras, but he knew it was only just beginning. When the car stopped, Zion was dragged out, his backpack left in the car. The cold room, not only cold to the skin but also to the mind, as if he was entering a life that he could not escape. But what no one expected was that when entering the courtroom, Zion did something that no one could imagine. He did not just protest, he completely overturned the case, proving that what they accused him of was wrong. Only, it did not come easily, and it would change his life forever.